The Brooklyn of Andrew Russo's boyhood in the 1950s wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing organism with its own rules, rhythms, and secrets. The air in the Bensonhurst neighborhood where he grew up was a mix of simmering tomato sauce, exhaust from passing Chevrolets, and the salty breeze from the not-so-distant shore. But more than anything, it carried the sound of voices. Italian, yes, but also the clipped English of the cops, the Yiddish of the shopkeepers on 86th Street, and the laughter of kids playing stickball in the fading evening light. For a young Andy, the neighborhood wasn't a map of streets, but a map of relationships, of quiet understandings and unspoken hierarchies. His father, a hardworking man who managed a produce warehouse, wasn't a part of the shadow world that existed just beneath the neighborhood's sunny surface. But he knew of it, and his warnings to his son were specific. You see men on the corner, Andy? You see them dressed nice, not going to a job? You look the other way. You mind your studies. Your future is in your head, not in their pockets. Andy heard the words, and he obeyed them. He was a good student, quiet, observant. But his eyes didn't look away. They absorbed everything. He saw the respect those well-dressed men commanded. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a gravity. When they walked into a social club, the laughter got a little louder, the greetings a little warmer. When they spoke to the owner of the corner bakery, a box of pastries would be handed over. No money exchanged. They fixed problems. When the son of a widow got into trouble with the law, it was one of these men who made a phone call, and the trouble mysteriously vanished. They were a parallel government, and their authority was woven into the fabric of daily life. Andy's real education began at the dinner table of his uncle, his mother's brother, a man who moved in different circles. The uncle wasn't a big shot, but he was a connected guy, a soldier, who did collections and ran a small numbers game. He saw something in Andy's quiet watchfulness. "You got smart eyes, kid," his uncle would say, pouring a little wine in Andy's glass during Sunday supper. "You see what's what. That's good. In this life, you gotta see the angles before they see you." One summer afternoon when Andy was 16, his uncle asked him for a favor. It sounded simple. Take a sealed, thick envelope to a cafe on 18th Avenue, ask for a man named Paulie, and hand it to him directly. Don't give it to nobody else. Don't stop for nothing. Just go, give, come back. The weight of the envelope, the specific instructions, the use of his uncle's real name instead of a nickname, Andy felt the significance. This wasn't an errand. It was a test. The cafe was small, dark, the air rich with espresso and anise. Men played cards in the back. Andy asked for Paulie. A large man with a kind face and cold eyes looked him over. "Who sent you?" "My uncle, Sal." A nod. The envelope changed hands. Paulie didn't open it. He simply tucked it inside his jacket and gave Andy a single, firm pat on the shoulder. "You're a good nephew. Tell Sal it's received. No thank you, no payment, just an acknowledgement of a completed transaction." Walking home, the empty-handed return felt heavier than the delivery. He had been a link in a chain he didn't fully understand, but he had performed flawlessly. He had been trustworthy. That night, his uncle didn't ask for details. He simply smiled and passed Andy the plate of Zeppole first, before anyone else. It was a silent promotion. Andy had graduated from being just a nephew to being a potential asset. He felt a surge of pride, but also a chill. He had stepped from the sunny sidewalk into the shade, and part of him knew there was no easy way back. The quiet boy from Bensonhurst was beginning to learn the neighborhood's truest, most valuable language, the language of silent, consequential deeds. The envelope was a key, and it opened. A door. Andy Russo's world, once bounded by school, family, and the stickball court, subtly expanded. His uncle, Sal, began to use him more often, but never for anything overtly illegal, at least not on the surface. Andy's job was to be a shadow, a messenger, a pair of reliable eyes and ears. He'd be asked to sit in a car outside a loan office for a few hours and note who came and went. He'd be given a list of names and addresses to verify. He learned to be invisible, to absorb details without appearing to watch. His payment was never cash. It was always something more valuable: inclusion. He was allowed to linger in the back room of the social club after running an errand, sipping a soda while the men talked in the low, rhythmic cadence of business. He heard snippets about points on a loan, VIG collection, trouble, with a union delegate that needed smoothing over. The language was a code, and Andy, with his quick mind, began to decipher it. He saw that this wasn't about thuggery. It was a commerce of influence, of solving problems that the legitimate world either created or ignored. One crisp autumn day, his uncle sent him to a small, nondescript storefront in Bay Ridge called 3-Star Catering. The instruction was to ask for Mr. Al and tell him the package from Jersey is delayed, but the merchandise is fine. Andy delivered the message verbatim to a bored-looking man behind a counter stacked with plastic-wrapped napkins. The man, Mr. Al, didn't react to the news. He just nodded, wiped his hands on his apron, and said, "Tell Sal the oven will be ready Monday. The special order." Walking out, Andy puzzled over the exchange. It was only later, when his uncle grunted in satisfaction at the reply, that Andy understood. The package from Jersey wasn't food. The oven wasn't for baking. He was learning that the entire neighborhood was a stage, and every ordinary business could have a second, hidden script. The catering company, he gradually learned, was a front for a sports betting operation. The oven was a new, secure phone line. His father noticed the change. The boy was quieter, more reserved, often lost in thought. "You're spending too much time with your uncle," he warned one night over dinner, his voice thick with concern. "That life, it's a shortcut to nowhere, Andy. It looks like easy money, but the price is your freedom. You understand? Your name. Once it's in their books, it's never clean." Andy looked at his father's hands, calloused from years of hauling crates of fruits and vegetables. They were honest hands, and they had provided a good, steady life. But Andy saw the limits of that honesty. His father would never own the warehouse. He would never command the quiet respect that Polly or Mr. Al did. He was a worker in someone else's system. Andy was being offered a chance, however murky, to understand the system itself, maybe even to own a piece of it one day. The pivotal moment came during a conflict that didn't involve his uncle directly. A friend of the family, a widow named Mrs. Gennaro who ran a struggling laundromat, was being strong-armed by a waste disposal company to sign an exorbitant contract. They'd threatened to have accidents with her delivery van if she refused. Frightened and alone, she came to Andy's mother, who in turn begged her brother Sal for help. Andy watched his uncle handle it. Sal didn't put on a tough guy act. He put on a good suit, took Andy with him for appearance's sake, and visited the waste company's office. He asked to see the manager. He introduced himself calmly, mentioned a few names the manager clearly recognized, and then, in a voice of pure reason, discussed the unfortunate misunderstandings regarding Mrs. Gennaro's service. He suggested a fair market rate for her contract, one he had scribbled on a notepad. The manager, sweating, agreed on the spot. No threats were uttered. No fists were raised. Power was simply demonstrated, like turning on a bright light in a dark room. Afterward, Mrs. Gennaro wept with gratitude, pressing food and blessings on Sal. In the car, Sal looked at Andy. "You see, we're not the monsters the newspapers say. We're the solution to the monsters. That woman, the police wouldn't lift a finger. The city wouldn't care. We cared. That's the business. We provide a service." Andy believed him. In that moment, the moral lines his father had drawn seemed blurry, academic. His uncle was a hero to Mrs. Gennaro. He had used his influence, the gravity Andy had always observed, to protect one of their own. Felt righteous, felt powerful. He was being seduced not by money, but by utility, by the sense of belonging to a powerful, protective family that extended far beyond blood. The quiet, observant boy was starting to crave the weight that came with being a man who could get things done. A man who commanded a room not by shouting, but by the subtle, unshakable authority of his connections. He was learning to think in terms of favors, of loyalty, of the intricate balance of obligation that was the true currency of his world. The student was becoming an apprentice. The summer Andy turned 18, the air in Brooklyn felt thicker, charged with a new kind of potential. He had graduated high school, and the question of what came next hung over the family dinner table like a persistent guest. His father pushed for college, talking about night school and business degrees. A man needs a trade, a real profession, he'd insist, his eyes boring into Andy's. But Andy's trade was already being apprenticed in the social clubs and parked cars of Bensonhurst. His Uncle Sal, recognizing a sharp and discreet mind, began to entrust him with more delicate work. It was no longer just about observation and delivery. It was about logistics and trust. His first real test involved a failing pizzeria on 13th Avenue. The owner, a proud man named Gio, had taken a loan from someone connected to Sal's crew to keep his doors open during a slow winter. The vig, the interest, had piled up and Gio had fallen behind. The usual collectors had been too heavy-handed, threatening and scaring away the few customers Gio had left. This was bad for business. A dead store couldn't pay anyone back. Sal called Andy into the back of the club. This Gio situation is a mess. The guys handling it are knuckle-draggers. They think pressure is the only tool. I want you to go down there, look at the books, not to scare him, to understand. Tell him you're from me, that we're gonna find a solution. I want to know if there's a business to save, or if we're just throwing good money after bad. Andy felt a flutter of nerves. This was analysis, not errand running. He put on his best dress shirt and slacks, aiming for a look that was professional, not intimidating. The pizzeria was indeed quiet, the air stale with yesterday's grease. Gio looked at him with red-ridden eyes, expecting another threat. Andy didn't sit. He extended a hand. Mr. Gio, Sal sent me. He's heard you're a good man in a tough spot. He wants to help figure this out if we can. The disbelief on Joe's face was pitiable. Slowly, warily, he brought out a stained ledger. For the next hour, Andy pored over it, asking quiet questions. He saw the problem immediately. Gio was a magnificent pizza maker but a terrible businessman. He was paying too much for his cheese from a single supplier out of loyalty. His weekend specials were losing money. He had no system. Andy reported back to Sal not with just the debt numbers, but with a diagnosis. The place can work, Andy said, surprising himself with his own confidence. But he needs to switch suppliers. He needs to change his menu a little, charge 20 cents more a pie. Nobody will blink. The guys leaning on him are making it worse. If we back off, give him a 3-month plan where he pays half the vig but pays the principal, and he follows some basic rules, he can dig out. He's loyal. If we help him, he'll be ours for life. Sal listened, stroking his chin. He then did something that shocked Andy. He laughed, a short bark of approval. You see? This is what I mean. The other guys, they see a number. You see the machine. You see how to fix the machine so it keeps making the number. He clapped Andy on the shoulder. You handle it. You're the point man on Gio. Check in with him every week. Help him set it right. For the next 3 months, Andy visited Gio every Tuesday afternoon. He helped him negotiate with a new cheese vendor, connected him with a bakery for better-priced bread. He became not a collector, but a consultant. Joe's gratitude was immense. His payments became regular, and the pizzeria's aroma of success slowly returned. Sal's crew got their money back with interest, and they gained a fiercely loyal business owner who would now quietly steer his friends toward their loan operations. Andy had solved his first real problem. The taste of it was sweet, complex. He had used his mind, not muscle. He had created order and profit from chaos. It felt profoundly more satisfying than any abstract grade on a college exam. That success, however, pulled him deeper into the architecture of the life. He was introduced to the man who ran the gambling operations for the neighborhood, a sharp-eyed, quiet fellow named Tommy who analyzed sports stats like a professor. Andy started helping Tommy with the board, recording bets from the network of candy stores and bars that served as betting windows. He learned about point spreads, about laying off risk, about the immense, quiet river of cash that flowed from a $20 bet on a baseball game. He was moving money now, not just messages. He carried envelopes from the betting parlors to the counting rooms, his calm, unassuming demeanor making him invisible to the outside world. He was a ghost in the machine, and the machine was beginning to depend on his smooth, reliable function. One evening, leaving a social club late, he ran into his old high school history teacher, Mr. Bianchi. The man looked at Andy, at his nicer clothes, at the subtle confidence that had replaced teenage awkwardness, and his friendly smile faded into something sadder. "Andrew Russo," he said, "I heard you were helping out your family. That's good. A man helps his family." He paused, his eyes knowing. "Just remember, Andy, not all help is helpful. Sometimes the biggest favor you can do someone is to walk away." The words rattled around Andy's head as he walked home. Walk away from what? From the respect he'd earned? From the tangible results of his work? From a system that valued his practical intelligence more than any school ever had? Mr. Bianchi lived in a world of ideas and moral absolutes. Andy lived in a world of concrete problems and concrete solutions. As he turned the key to his parents' house, he felt a pang of dislocation. He was beginning to outgrow the world that had made him, and the new world he was entering promised power and purpose, but demanded a price he was only beginning to comprehend. The quiet boy was gone, replaced by a young man deep in the current, learning to swim with purpose and wondering, for the first time, how far from shore he had already drifted. The rhythm of Andy's new life settled into a predictable, demanding cadence. The 1970s unfolded, and with them the stakes grew. He was no longer just his Uncle Sal's smart nephew. He was a recognized earner with a head for numbers and a cool demeanor. He moved out of his parents' home, renting a clean, modest apartment a few neighborhoods over. The independence was a declaration, a quiet signal that he was his own man, operating in his own sphere. His primary focus remained the gambling operations with Tommy, but it had evolved. Andy wasn't just recording bets. He was helping to manage the wire room, a nondescript apartment where offshore racing results came in over crackling phone lines, and where the day's take was counted and prepared for banking. It was a nerve center, and Andy proved to have the perfect temperament for it. Patient, meticulous, and utterly unfazed by the large sums of money that passed over the table. He saw it as revenue, not treasure. This efficiency brought him to the attention of the people above Tommy. One evening, Sal took him to a restaurant in Sheepshead Bay, a place with white tablecloths and a view of the marina. They were joined by an older man named Carmine, who had a gentle voice and eyes that missed nothing. Carmine asked Andy about cash flow, about security, about the challenges of customer retention in a competitive illegal market. Andy answered plainly, without boast, focusing on systems and risk management. After the espresso was served, Carmine nodded slowly. "Salvatore says you have a quiet mind. The world is loud, Andrew. A quiet mind is a valuable thing." A week later, Andy was given a piece of a sports book, a small percentage of the profits from a network of betting agents in South Brooklyn. It was his first real taste of ownership, of moving from a salary to a share. It was a formal induction into the brotherhood of profit. With this success came a heavier burden of awareness. He began to understand the true architecture of the family. A term he learned was not metaphorical. It was called the Colombo Family. He learned the names not as bogeymen from newspaper headlines, but as individuals with styles and strategies. The persistent Joe Colombo, the more reserved Thomas DeBella. The internal politics were a subtle undercurrent, a game of allegiance and positioning that was as complex as any corporate ladder. Andy navigated it by staying focused on his work, by being reliable and generating clean, quiet profit. He avoided the flashy guys, the loud talkers in flashy suits who drew attention. His power grew from his silence and his results. This widening gap between his two lives became most painful at home. Sunday dinners at his parents' house became strained, silent affairs. His father, seeing the new car, the better clothes, The confident set of his son's shoulders could no longer fool himself. The warnings had stopped. They were replaced by a deep, disappointed silence. One evening, as Andy helped clear the table, his father finally spoke, his voice low and thick. "You provide for your mother and me. I see that. You're a good son that way. But what you provide, it has a smell on it, Andy. It's not the smell of the earth or the warehouse. It's a different smell, and it doesn't wash off." Andy looked at his father's stooped shoulders, the hands that still bore the marks of honest labor. He felt a surge of defensive anger, but also a pang of loss. He wanted to explain that he was building something, creating order, providing a service. But the language of his new world would be alien and ugly in this kitchen. So he said nothing, just nodded and finished clearing the plates. The silence between them was now a wall. The external pressures began to mount as well. The law was no longer a distant concept. The FBI, armed with new racketeering laws, started making overt moves. They conducted highly publicized raids on social clubs, not just making arrests, but seizing assets. Andy saw familiar faces on the evening news, walking scowling into courthouses. The term RICO began to be whispered with a new kind of dread. It was no longer about arresting a man for a single crime. It was about dismantling an entire enterprise, connecting the dots from the street collector to the man in the fine suit. Andy's response was to tighten his own operations, to make his piece of the machine even more efficient and less visible. He insisted on moving the wire room every 6 weeks. He diversified the banking of the proceeds, using small check-cashing businesses and foreign currency exchanges. He was applying his merchant's mind to the problem of survival. One night, leaving a late counting session, he saw a dark sedan parked across the street. It hadn't been there an hour before. The engine was off, but he could make out 2 figures inside. They weren't hiding. They were watching. A cold clarity washed over him. This was no longer just a career choice. It was a life under a microscope. The gravity he had admired, the respect he had craved, came with this unblinking opposite force. He drove home by a circuitous route, his mind racing. He thought of Gio, the pizzeria owner, now thriving and loyal. He thought of the steady flow of money that provided for his parents, for himself. He thought of his father's smell of the earth and the invisible, indelible smell his father accused him of carrying. He had built a bridge from the old world to the new, but he was stranded in the middle. The shore he had left was receding, fading into memory and disappointment. The shore he was approaching was shrouded in fog, its shape uncertain, its welcoming committee comprised of men in dark sedans with binoculars and subpoenas. Andrew Russo, the quiet strategist, was realizing that the most complex system he had yet to analyze was the trap he might have built for himself. The dark sedan became a regular feature in the periphery of Andy's life, a ghost at the feast of his success. He learned its makes, its rhythms, the bland, interchangeable faces of the agents inside. They were part of the scenery now, attacks on the life he led. He developed habits to manage them, varying his routes, conducting sensitive conversations on payphones in crowded terminals, using the language of legitimate business as a cover even when speaking to trusted associates. Paranoia, he learned, was just another form of diligence. His work within the Colombo family's gambling operations continued to excel. His wire rooms were models of efficiency and security. The profits from his piece of the sports book grew, and with it, his influence. He was invited to more meetings, his opinion sought on matters beyond. Pure numbers, on disputes between independent bookmakers, on the viability of new office locations. He was becoming a manager, a problem solver. The family, in its way, was promoting him. This new status culminated in an invitation that was both an honor and a millstone. He was asked to attend the wedding of a high-ranking captain's daughter. This wasn't just a social event. It was a tableau of the life, a gathering of the extended family in all its generations. The hall was opulent, dripping with chandeliers and overflowing with food and wine. Men with familiar faces from news articles clasped hands with judges and city councilmen. It was a display of power and integration that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Andy went, wearing a suit that cost more than his father made in a month. He moved through the room, shaking hands, exchanging polite smiles. He saw his Uncle Sal, beaming with pride, introducing him as my nephew, Andrew, a sharp young man. In that room, he was not an outsider. He was a promising scion. He felt the gravitational pull of belonging, of being part of something vast and powerful that celebrated its own. But his eyes were also drawn to the edges of the celebration. He noticed the discreet bulges under suit jackets, the men who stood with their backs to the wall, watching the doors, watching the crowd. He saw the photographers outside, not from the society pages, but from the newspapers and the FBI, their long lenses capturing every arrival and departure. The splendor was real, but it was a castle under siege. The conflict within him crystallized a few weeks later. His father suffered a minor heart attack. It was not life-threatening, but it was a profound shock, a lightning strike on the already fractured landscape of their relationship. Andy rushed to the hospital, his mind filled with a fear more basic than any FBI threat. In the sterile, quiet room, his father looked small, tethered to beeping machines. When he awoke, his eyes found Andy's. There was no anger there, only a weary sadness. All this running, his father whispered, his voice raspy. For what? To end up in a room like this, alone? Or in another kind of room with bars? The words hit Andy with physical force. He stayed, handling the hospital paperwork, ensuring the best care, using his connections to get a specialist to consult. He provided just as he always had. But his father's question echoed in the silent moments. For what? The answer came from the other side of his life with relentless clarity. With the boss, Joe Colombo, becoming a public figure, staging rallies, forming the Italian-American Civil Rights League, the family was in a frenzied, precarious spotlight. The internal criticism of Colombo's visibility was a low rumble. Andy kept his head down, managing his gambling concerns, but the political earthquake hit when Joe Colombo was shot and gravely wounded at his own rally in 1971. The chaos was immediate and profound. The family leadership was thrown into disarray. A quiet, vicious struggle for position began in the vacuum. All operations were under unprecedented scrutiny. For Andy, it meant his clean, profitable gambling network was now a liability. The heat was unbearable. He was instructed to shut down his most profitable wire rooms, to lie low. Sitting in his empty, silent apartment, the wire room phones disconnected, Andy faced the reality of his enterprise. It was not a standalone business. It was a subsidiary of a larger, volatile corporation. Its fortunes were tied to the actions and fate of men he barely knew, men whose ambitions could, and did, spark public violence. The steady, reliable machine he had built could be switched off by forces far beyond his control. He thought of the wedding, the display of power. He thought of his father in the hospital bed, speaking of rooms with bars. He thought of the dark sedan that was, even now, probably parked outside. For the first time, Andrew Russo contemplated not just risk, but impermanence. He had built a career on providing stability and solving problems within an unstable system. Now, the system itself was the problem. The shrewd, quiet mind that had found his path now began, with cold, slow dread, to search for an exit. But exits in this world were not marked on the door. To look for one was the most dangerous gamble of all. The shooting of Joe Colombo didn't just create a power vacuum. It sent a seismic shock through the very foundations of Andrew Russo's world. The quiet, predictable economy of respect and profit was replaced by a brittle, watchful tension. The family, once a source of steady gravity, now felt like a ship with a cracked helm, drifting into dangerous waters. For Andy, the order to lie low was an existential threat. An idle earner was a vulnerable earner. A shutdown operation could be claimed by someone else. He couldn't afford to disappear. Instead, he adapted. He used the chaos as cover to restructure. He dismantled his central wire room apparatus and decentralized it, creating smaller, more mobile units, often just a guy with a phone and a notepad in a different rented apartment each day. He leaned into his network of independent agents, the barbers and bartenders who took the bets, making them more autonomous but taking a smaller, safer percentage. He was making his piece of the puzzle smaller, harder to see, and less dependent on the faltering center. This strategy drew the attention of the faction that saw opportunity in the disorder. He was summoned to a meeting not by his usual contacts, but by a man named Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, a figure known to be quietly maneuvering for greater control in the wounded family's hierarchy. They met in the back of a clam bar in Canarsie, the smell of salt and lemon a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Persico was younger than the old guard, sharper in dress, with a calculating gaze that reminded Andy of his own reflection. "Your books," Persico said, skipping pleasantries. "They're still green when others are seeing red. You're moving differently. Why?" Andy chose his words with the care of a bomb technician. "The old way made a big target, Mr. Persico. A single light draws all the moths and the bats. I'm using smaller lights, scattered. It's less profitable per bulb, but when one goes out, the whole room doesn't go dark." Persico studied him, a faint, approving smile touching his lips. A practical mind. The future belongs to practical men. The loud days are over. The quiet, steady flow, that's what survives. The message was clear. Persico represented a new approach, and he saw Andy as a natural asset. It was an offer of alignment, not a request. This new connection was a double-edged sword. It offered protection and potential advancement in the new order, but it also tied him more deeply to a specific faction in a brewing internal war. Andy's father's warning about their books echoed in his mind. His name was being noted in a different ledger now. The external pressure intensified in lockstep. The FBI, capitalizing on the family's public trauma, launched a sweeping offensive. Subpoenas flew like confetti. Grand juries demanded testimony. The dark sedans became more brazen. One afternoon, 2 agents in cheap suits approached him directly as he left the diner. "Andrew Russo, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We'd love to have a chat about your career in hospitality and logistics." They flashed badges, their smiles cold and professional. Andy's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained a placid mask. "I have a lawyer for conversations," he said, his voice even. "If you have questions, you can speak through him." He handed them his attorney's business card, a well-worn move he had prepared for. "You're a smart guy, Andrew," one agent said, tucking the card away. "Smart guys know when the weather's changing. The storm is not blowing over. It's going to wash a lot of people out to sea. Think about which boat you want to be in." The encounter left him cold. They weren't trying to arrest him. They were trying to recruit him. They wanted him to flip to become an informant. The realization was as terrifying as any threat from a rival faction. It meant they had enough on him to pressure him, but wanted more. They wanted the structure, the connections, the map he carried in his head. That night, he sat in his dark apartment, the city's glow seeping around the blinds. He felt the walls closing in from both sides. From within, the family was fracturing, demanding loyalty to one shifting faction or another. From without, the government was offering a different, treacherous kind of salvation. The quiet, profitable middle ground he had cultivated was vanishing. He thought of Persico's praise for his practicality. He thought of the agent's metaphor of the storm. Andy Russo, the problem solver, was now the problem. His entire life had been built on assessing risk and finding the most stable path through chaos. But for the first time, every path seemed to lead to ruin of his freedom, his standing, or his soul. The shrewd young man who had found angles in everything now faced a calculus with no positive solution. He had to make a choice not between right and wrong, but between different kinds of endings. And the clock, ticked by the FBI's patience and the family's internal strife, was growing louder in his ears. The storm the FBI agent had promised didn't arrive with thunder, but with a slow, chilling drizzle of legal paperwork. Subpoenas became a regular part of Andy's mail. They demanded bank records, phone bills, lists of business associates. They were fishing, but with a very specific map of the lake. Each document request felt like a pin on that map, circling closer to the hidden places. Andy's response was a masterclass in passive resistance. He and his lawyer would comply, but slowly, and with volumes of irrelevant documentation, reams of legitimate business records from the small, above-board vending machine company he'd quietly acquired years earlier as a cover. They would bury the needles in a haystack of paper, buying time, costing the government manpower to sift through it all. It was a war of attrition, fought in triplicate. His alliance with the Persico faction solidified through necessity. In the fractured family, you needed a flag to fly, and Alley Boy's banner was one of modern, low-profile profit. Andy's decentralized gambling network was a perfect fit. He was given greater responsibility, overseeing a portfolio of street taxes, the small, regular payments from businesses in certain neighborhoods for protection, and the privilege to operate. It was old school, but Persico wanted it run with new school efficiency. No broken windows, no threatening visits. Just a polite, recurring invoice for a neighborhood association fee, with consequences for non-payment that were understood, not spoken. Andy managed it like a utilities company. He had a ledger, a schedule, and a team of collectors who were instructed to be courteous. He was systematizing the shakedown, sanding off the rough edges, making it look and feel like just another business tax. It was profitable, and it kept him useful and visible within the new hierarchy. But the duality of his existence was becoming unbearable. One afternoon, he was in a Brooklyn courthouse annex, waiting in a hallway with his lawyer to respond to a subpoena. He was wearing a conservative suit, looking every inch the hassled businessman. Across the hall, he saw a familiar face, Mikey Spatz, a low-level guy from the old days who'd been a runner for a competing bookie. Mikey was being led in by two detectives, cuffed, looking flushed and angry. Their eyes met. Mikey's expression shifted from anger to a sneering recognition. He didn't say a word, but his look said it all. Asterisk, look at you, in your fancy suit. We're the same, but you think you're clean. Asterisk. In that moment, Andy felt the absurd fragility of his facade. The same institution that was pressuring him was processing Mikey 100 feet away. They were in different lanes, but on the same highway. The true test of his new position came not from the law, but from within the family. A dispute arose over territory in Red Hook. A crew loyal to a rival faction was muscling in on the street tax collection from a series of auto body shops that fell under Andy's purview. It wasn't about the money. It was a test of Persico's authority, and by extension, Andy's ability to defend his claim. The old way would have been a violent clash. Andy knew that's what many expected, even wanted, a show of force to prove their strength. But he also knew that violence was a magnet for the FBI surveillance that was undoubtedly watching. He requested a sit-down with the rival crew's captain, a man named Rocco. They met in a public place, a busy Italian cafe in Carroll Gardens. Andy went alone, a sign of respect and confidence. Rocco brought two men. The body shops, Rocco started, stirring sugar into his espresso. There's a history there. My people have relationships. Relationships can be respected, Andy replied calmly. But the current arrangement provides stability. The shops know what to expect. Switching hands causes confusion. Confusion causes mistakes. Mistakes bring police. Rocco scoffed. Since when are we afraid of police? We're not, Andy said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping. We're afraid of losing the monthly rent because the shop owner is talking to detectives about who threatened him last Tuesday. My way, the owner writes a check to a shell corporation for security consulting. He grumbles, he pays, he never sees us. Your way, maybe he pays more out of fear, but he also sees faces, remembers names. He becomes a witness, not just a customer. He let the logic hang in the air. He was appealing not to tradition or strength, but to risk management. The revenue from those 6 shops, Andy continued, let's split it, 60-40 your way. You get the larger share for acknowledging the existing relationship. But my crew administers it, quietly, The shops see one face, my face. No confusion. No new witnesses for the FBI to cultivate. It was a concession, but it was also a strategic retreat that preserved the peace and, more importantly, kept the operations invisible. Rocco, a practical man himself, saw the wisdom. He agreed. Andy had won without a shot by thinking like the enemy, the federal enemy. He reported the compromise to Persico, who listened silently. You gave him points, Persico finally said. I gave him a percentage to avoid 100% headache, Andy replied. We keep the control, we keep the peace, and we give the G-men nothing to photograph. A slow smile spread across Persico's face. You see the bigger board. Good. But winning on the bigger board came with a cost. The FBI, monitoring the truce, saw it as proof of Andy's growing managerial role. He wasn't a soldier, he was a diplomat, an executive. That made him more valuable and a bigger target. Walking to his car after the meeting with Persico, Andy felt the weight of his own success. He was too valuable to the family to discard, and too knowledgeable for the FBI to ignore. He was climbing a ladder, but it was leaning against a wall that was being slowly chipped away from both sides. The quiet, practical mind that had solved so many problems was now orchestrating its own inevitable crisis. He had become a central node in a network that was, day by day, being illuminated by the relentless spotlight of the law. He could feel the heat. The compromise with Rocco was a textbook example of Andy's philosophy, and it worked. The street tax money flowed smoothly, split according to the new agreement, without a whisper of violence. The auto body shops paid their consulting fees and were left in peace. In the ledgers, Andy kept, it was just another revenue stream, clean and efficient. But in the real world, his success was drawing a target on his back that no amount of careful accounting could erase. The FBI's storm shifted from a chilly drizzle to a sustained, gusty downpour. The subpoenas stopped being broad fishing expeditions and became precise surgical instruments. They requested records for specific dates, transactions with specific shell corporations he used. They knew names he had never written down. The realization was a cold knot in Andy's stomach. They had a source. Someone inside the orbit was talking, wearing a wire or both. The quiet, trusting world he operated in was now acoustically tiled, every word potentially echoing in a federal evidence room. His lawyer, a weary man named Feldman who had seen it all, laid it out bluntly after reviewing a new batch of demands. They're building a RICO case, Andrew. They're not after you for gambling or extortion. They're after you for being part of a continuing criminal enterprise. They're connecting your dots to Persico's dots, to the family's dots. They want to put the whole puzzle away at once. Andy knew about RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was the law's sledgehammer. It could take a lifetime of careful, small crimes and stack them into a single mountain-sized sentence. His practical mind saw the terrifying logic of it. His entire career, his climb, was just evidence of his participation in the enterprise. The pressure seeped into his personal sanctuary, his apartment. He began a nightly ritual, sweeping the rooms for listening devices, not with professional gear, but with a paranoid, meticulous eye. He unplugged lamps, checked phone receivers, ran the faucet during sensitive conversations. The silence of his home was no longer peaceful. It was suspect, pregnant with the possibility of betrayal. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. His mother called her voice, thin with a fear that had nothing to do with the law. His father's health was failing again, and the medical bills from the first heart attack were a lingering, suffocating burden. His father's pride had prevented him from asking for more help, but the stress was making him worse. Andy handled it immediately and quietly. He paid off the outstanding bills through a third party, arranged for a private nurse, and had a mortgage payment on their house taken care of for a year. He did it all through layers, ensuring the help felt like luck or a distant charity. He provided as he always had, but when he visited his father, now frail in a chair by the window, the old man looked at him with eyes that were clear and unbearably sad. "The nurse is very kind," he said. "A blessing." He paused, his gaze holding Andy's. You can pay for a nurse, son. But who's going to take care of you? The question was a needle to the heart. Andy had no answer. His support system was the same organization that was putting him in the crosshairs. His friendships were alliances. His family was a source of love, but also of agonizing moral distance. Soon after, the external and internal pressures collided. A made man from the Persico crew, a fellow Andy worked with closely on the gambling side, was arrested. Not for a minor pinch, but on a federal racketeering charge. The news was delivered to Andy in a frantic, encrypted phone call. The man, Vinny, was known to be tough but loyal. The fear wasn't that he would talk immediately. The fear was what the FBI would offer him. 20 years versus a witness protection relocation for his whole family was a calculation that could break anyone. Persico summoned Andy. The meeting was in a moving car this time, a long, silent drive through the Belt Parkway. Vinny knows the structure, Persico said, staring out at the passing industrial yards. He knows you. He knows the routes, the percentages, the code for the wire rooms. I never discussed code. With Vinny, Andy said, his mind racing. He handled distribution, not operations. He knows enough, Persico said flatly. If he flips, he's a path to you. If he's a path to you, he's a path to me. He finally turned his head, his expression unreadable. You're a smart guy, Andrew. You've built a lot of quiet walls. Now we see if they can hold back the tide. The message was unmistakable. Andy's fate was now tied to Vinny's silence. And Vinny's silence was in the hands of the FBI, who now had a vulnerable, valuable piece on their board. Andy was no longer just managing risk, he was the risk. Driving home alone afterwards, the paranoia wasn't a ritual anymore. It was his environment. Every car behind him was a tail. Every pedestrian on a phone was an agent. The dark sedan was now a fleet, visible only in his mind's eye, but no less real. He thought of his father's question. Asterisk, who's going to take care of you? Asterisk, the answer, terrifyingly, was no one. The family would protect its own interests, which might or might not align with his survival. The government would care for him only if he agreed to destroy everything and everyone he knew. Andrew Russo, the architect of quiet, profitable systems, sat at the center of a network that was vibrating with imminent collapse. The pressure was no longer just legal or financial. It was existential. He had to make a choice not about business, but about survival. And for the first time, his shrewd, calculating mind could not find a third option, a clever angle. There was only the relentless, closing vice. He had spent a lifetime learning to speak the neighborhood's silent language of deeds. Now, the loudest voice was the ticking of the clock, counting down to his moment of impossible decision. The silence after Vinny's arrest was the loudest thing Andrew Russo had ever heard. Days bled into weeks with no news. No indictment, no plea deal announced in the papers, no whispers from the courthouse steps. It was the silence of the interrogation room, of decisions being weighed in sterile offices under fluorescent lights. Andy moved through his routines like a ghost. The ledgers were updated, the collections happened, the profits were logged. But his focus was fractured. His mind perpetually across the river in whatever federal holding cell contained Vinny. He saw the strain mirrored in the faces around him. Greetings in the social club were quicker, eyes darting away after a handshake. Conversations halted when he entered a room, not out of disrespect, but from a universal, unspoken understanding. Walls had ears, and some of those ears might now belong to Vinny. Trust, the invisible currency his world ran on, was undergoing a catastrophic deflation. His physical world shrank accordingly. He abandoned his apartment, staying in a rotation of nondescript, paid-in-cash hotel rooms in different boroughs. He communicated through a series of disposable pay-as-you-go phones, changing them every few days. He was a CEO running a corporation from a series of hiding places, his boardroom a booth in a different diner each morning. The FBI, perhaps sensing his isolation, changed tactics. The subpoenas stopped. Instead, the pressure became personal, psychological. He arrived at one of his hotel rooms to find a business card neatly placed on the pillow. It belonged to an assistant United States attorney. On the back, written in precise block letters, was a message. Asterisk, the first one to cooperate determines the narrative. The second one goes to prison. Your choice. Asterisk, no one had broken into the room. The card had been left by a maid. A perfectly legal delivery. It was a demonstration of reach, a reminder that there were no hiding places, only intervals between contacts. The most devastating blow, however, came from within what was left of his personal life. He risked a visit to his parents' house, parked blocks away and approaching through back alleys like a thief. He needed to see them to grasp something real. His mother hugged him tightly, her eyes wet. His father, diminished in his chair, merely looked at him. Your friend, his father said, his voice a dry leaf. The one they took, Vinny, his wife, Maria. She came to the church. She asked the priest to pray for his soul. She said he was a good man, that he was just trying to provide. His father's gaze was unwavering. She doesn't know yet what he'll have to do to come home. But you know, don't you, Andy? You know the price. Andy couldn't speak. His father, from his world of simple truths and hard labor, had just articulated the terrifying calculus of the federal system. The price for Vinny's return might be Andy's own freedom, or Persico's. It was a trade, a brutal, logical trade. He left the house shattered. The moral clarity he had always clung to, that he provided, that he solved problems, was crumbling. He was no longer a solution. He was a variable in a deadly equation. He was either an asset to the government or a liability to the family. There was no third status. A week later, the signal he had been dreading finally came, not through a news report, but through the family's own damaged nervous system. A meeting was called, not at a social club, but in the basement of a closed fish market in Gravesend. The smell of old salt and decay was overwhelming. Persico was there, along with a few other grim-faced men. The word is, Persico said, his voice echoing slightly in the damp space. Our friend is talking, not about the past, about the future. He's telling them how things work now, the structures, the partnerships. He didn't look at Andy, but the meaning was clear. Vinny was giving them the blueprint to the rebuilt, modernized operation, Andy's operation. One of the other men, an older, weathered captain named Frank, spat on the concrete floor. A rat poisons the whole nest. We need to know how much he's said. We need to know what's compromised. All eyes turned to Andy. He was the architect. He was the one who could look at the blueprint and see which load-bearing walls Vinny might be describing. They know about the shell corporations, Andy said, his voice hollow in the gloom. They knew the names to subpoena. They know the general structure of the street tax operation, the consulting fee model. If he's talking about the gambling, he knows the agent network, but not the moving wire rooms. I kept that separate. Separate enough? Persico asked, the question hanging in the foul air. Andy had no answer. Separation was a concept for accountants and strategists. For the FBI with a cooperative witness, it was just a series of connections to be made, a puzzle to be solved with the help of the man who helped build it. The meeting ended with no resolution, only a mandate to freeze all but the most essential activities. Andy walked out into the night, the harbor air doing nothing to clear the stench from his nostrils or his mind. He was now the central figure in a silent, three-way war between the family's need to protect itself, the government's desire to dismantle it, and a witness who held the key to both. He drove to the waterfront and sat in his car, watching the lights of the Staten Island ferry crawl across the black water. He thought of Vinny, somewhere in a featureless room, trading secrets for a chance to see his wife again. He thought of his father, understanding the price before it was even paid. He thought of the business card on the hotel pillow. Andrew Russo had spent his life valuing control above all else. Now he had none. The narrative, as the prosecutor's note had said, was being written by others. His choice was no longer about how to succeed, but about how to survive the inevitable collapse. And for the first time, survival seemed to require an act that felt, in the marrow of his being, like a betrayal of everything he was. The quiet man was being forced to choose his own voice, and whatever he said would destroy a part of his world forever. The world did not end with a bang, but with a slow, meticulous unraveling. The fallout from Vinny's cooperation was not a sudden raid, but a systematic dismantling. Over the next several months, Andrew Russo watched as the architecture he had so carefully built was taken apart, piece by piece, from the outside. First, the shell corporations. Official-looking letters arrived, not at the mail drops, but at the registered agents' offices. The state was dissolving them for failure to comply with reporting requirements. Then, the bank accounts associated with those corporations were frozen. Not seized, just frozen, a bureaucratic limbo that rendered the money useless. The consulting fee payments from the auto body shops and other businesses began to bounce. The quiet, reliable river of cash slowed to a trickle, then dried up entirely. The FBI made no move to arrest Andy. Instead, they targeted the infrastructure around him. Agents visited the owners of the businesses who had paid the street tax. They didn't threaten. They offered immunity in exchange for simple statements confirming they had made regular payments to specific entities for protection. Most, terrified of both the government and the void left by the absent collectors, quietly complied. The case was being built on paper, not on wiretaps, on the fossil record of his own financial system. The family's response was a retreat into deeper shadows. Persico became a ghost. Communications ceased almost entirely. The social clubs that had been the nerve centers of the neighborhood felt empty, not of people but of purpose. The men who remained were older, quieter, waiting for a storm they knew had already made landfall. The message was clear. Everyone was on their own. The organization was severing its own limbs to save the body. Andy lived in a state of suspended animation. He was neither free nor captive. He was in the open, waiting for a hand to fall on his shoulder that never came. The hotel rooms, the disposable phones, it all began to feel like a pointless pantomime. They knew where he was. They were just choosing not to act yet. The only thing that remained real was his family. His father's condition stabilized, but the man was a hollow echo of himself, his spirit crushed by the dual burdens of illness and a son's path. Andy continued to provide, but the money now came from the last of his legitimate reserves. The vending machine business, a small slice of a car service. The illicit riches were locked away, frozen or too dangerous to touch. One afternoon, his lawyer, Feldman, called him to his office. The man looked exhausted. He slid a thick document across the desk. It was a draft plea agreement from the U.S. Attorney's office. "It's not for you," Feldman said. "It's Vinny's. They gave me a copy. Part of the negotiation." Andy stared at the cover page. It detailed charges: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and a recommended sentence range so long it was effectively a life term for a man Vinny's age. Then, stamped across it in red, was the word cooperation agreement. The specifics were blacked out, but the implication was clear. To get this deal, Vinny had already given them everything. And the terms of his cooperation would include testifying against others. "Where's my offer?" Andy asked, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Feldman sighed. "They don't make offers to the top of the pyramid first, Andrew. They build the case from the bottom, from the edges. They use the Vinnies to get to the Persicos. They're not at you yet. When they get to you, the offer won't be a deal. It'll be an ultimatum. Life in prison, or give them the one above you. Persico." They wanted Andy to give them Alley Boy. He left the lawyer's office and walked. He walked for hours through neighborhoods he knew like the back of his hand, past closed social clubs and thriving bakeries, past old men on stoops who glanced at him and then quickly looked away. He was a marked man, and the mark was invisible but understood by all. He found himself outside the old pizzeria, Joe's Place. It was still there, still thriving. The smell of baking dough and tomatoes wafted out. He saw Gio inside, laughing with a customer, his face full of life. Andy had saved this place. He had fixed the machine. And now, the tools he used to fix it were the very things that would condemn him. He didn't go in. He kept walking, finally stopping at the waterfront, the same place he'd come after the fish market meeting. The sky was gray, the water choppy. The realization that settled over him was cold and absolute. The FBI's strategy was genius. They weren't chasing him. They were making his life unlivable. They had turned his own systems against him, frozen his assets, turned his associates into witnesses, and isolated him from his own organization. They were waiting for him to break, to walk into their office, desperate for a way out. And the family was gone. It had retreated into a survival bunker, and there was no room for him inside. He was a liability, a hotspot of federal attention. Persico's praise for his practical mind now felt like a death sentence. He was practical, which meant he could see the end of the game as clearly as they could. The two worlds his father had warned him about, the honest world of sweat and the shadow world of easy money, had both rejected him. One found him morally stained. The other found him tactically compromised. He pulled out the latest disposable phone. He had one number left to call that mattered. He dialed his parents' house. His mother answered. "Ma," he said, his voice rough. "Is Dad awake?" "He's resting, Andy. Do you want me to?" "No, don't wake him. Just tell him I'm working on it. Tell him I'm figuring a way out of this. For all of us." Her silence was filled with a hope so fragile it broke his heart. "Okay, son, be careful." "I will." He ended the call and threw the phone into the harbor. It was a childish, futile gesture, but it felt like the only free action left to him. Andrew Russo, the quiet strategist, had run out of strategies. He was cornered by the consequences of his own success. The government held the threat of a life behind bars. The family offered only the cold comfort of abandonment. And the man in the middle, the problem solver, had finally encountered a problem with no solution, only a choice between two kinds of destruction. The waiting was over. The next move he knew would have to be his, and it would be the last move of the game. The gray waters of the harbor held no answers, only the finality of his own reflection staring back from the driver's side window. The phone was gone, a cheap plastic offering to the deep. The gesture was symbolic, but the truth was heavier, sinking to a place he couldn't reach. Andrew Russo drove away from the waterfront not with a plan, but with a single, clear understanding. The architecture of his life was gone. The walls had been blueprinted by a witness, the foundation was being subpoenaed into evidence, and the roof was about to cave in. He did not go to a hotel. He drove to his parents' house. He parked a block away, not out of stealth anymore, but out of a need for one last moment of separation before he crossed a line from which there was no return. The walk to the familiar door felt longer than any journey he'd ever taken. His mother opened the door, her face a mask of worry that dissolved into relief at the sight of him. She pulled him inside. The house was quiet, the only sound the low murmur of a television from the back bedroom. "He's awake," she whispered. "He's having a good day. He's clear." Andy nodded and walked down the short hallway. His father was propped up in bed, the window open a crack to let in the cool evening air. He looked frail, his hands resting on the blanket like fallen leaves, but his eyes were alert. They tracked Andy as he entered and sat in the chair by the bed. For a long moment, neither spoke. The television played a game show, the audience's laughter a tinny, distant sound. "You figured it out," his father said, his voice a soft rasp. It wasn't a question. Andy looked at his hands, then back at his father. The pretense, the careful explanations, the merchant's logic. It all seemed absurd now. "There's no figuring," Andy said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "There's just choosing, and every choice is wrong." His father was silent, absorbing this. He slowly turned his head to look out the window at the slice of deepening blue sky. "When I was a boy," he began, "my father, your nano, had a fig tree in the yard, a beautiful thing, but one year a blight got into it, started in one branch. You could cut the branch, try to save the tree, or you could let it spread and lose the whole thing." He paused, gathering breath. He cut the branch. It hurt the tree. It was ugly, that scar. But the tree lived. It bore fruit again. He turned his gaze back to Andy, his eyes shimmering. Sometimes, to save the life of the thing, you have to cut a piece of it away, even if it's a piece you love. Andy felt a hot pressure behind his eyes. His father wasn't talking about fig trees. He was giving permission, in his own way, for the unforgivable. He was saying that survival, true survival, sometimes required a betrayal of the very form you were trying to save. "I'm sorry," Andy whispered, the words inadequate for a lifetime of diverging paths. His father reached out a trembling hand. Andy took it. The grip was weak, but the connection was electric, a final transfer of something wordless. "You be the one who cuts the branch, Andy. Don't let them burn the whole tree down with you in it." Andy left the house an hour later, after his father had fallen asleep. He kissed his weeping mother on the forehead. He didn't say goodbye. He walked to his car, the night air cool on his face. He drove to a payphone, outside a closed gas station. He fed coins into the slot. He did not call his lawyer. He dialed the number he had memorized from the business card left on his hotel pillow weeks before. It rang twice. "Assistant United States Attorney Miller," a crisp voice answered. "This is Andrew Russo," he said, his voice utterly flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm ready to talk about the narrative." There was the briefest pause on the other end, not of surprise, but of satisfied expectation. "We'll send a car. Stay where you are." He hung up. He leaned against the glass of the phone booth, looking up at the few stars visible through the city's glow. The quiet he felt was not peace, but a profound, hollowed-out emptiness. The howling tension of the past year was gone, replaced by the cold silence of a decision executed. He had chosen to save the tree. He had chosen to become the cut. He was not a hero. He was not even a victim. He was a practical man who had reached the end of his practical options. The government would get their prize, his testimony against Alphonse Persico and the structure of the modern Colombo family. In return, he would get a number, a sentence of years, not decades. He would get a new name, a new place, a life in the silent, watchful purgatory of witness protection. The black sedans arrived, not with sirens, but with a smooth, professional urgency. He got into the back of one without a word. As it pulled away, he did not look back at the neighborhood, at the closed social clubs, at the streets he had once believed he understood. He looked straight ahead, through the windshield, at the road illuminated by the headlights. It was a road leading away from everything he had been, from Ignacio Lupo's imported shadows to his own constructed empire. He had spent a lifetime learning to speak in the silent language of deeds. Now, his voice would become a weapon in a courtroom, his words dissecting the very world that had given him meaning. The story of Andrew Russo, the quiet man, would end not with a bang or a war, but with a deal made in a payphone's dim light, under a sky that no longer felt like his own. The last move had been played. The game was over.